Hello. It's been some time, and I didn't mean for it to be so long, but girl, we've been falling apart, and I still have an ear infection, which is impacting my ability to be coherent. Oh man, it's kind of wild. But yeah, and this ear infection definitely has me struggling. It's hard for me to focus. It's hard for me to be coherent. It just jumbles everything between my ears, my sinuses, up here, the brain. But the party can't stop because we have a whole book club to run. And shout out to Audible for making that feasible because, baby, I might not be able to focus on the words, but listening with my one good ear has helped me been able to keep up with all the reading that I have to do. And so if you are new to Audible, use my code audible.com/Julesy or text Julesy to 500 and get your first month free. I'm telling you. Audible is awesome. And every video I do, I always relate it back to various readings. So of course, even within this video, I will have some recommendations that you can pull from Audible. Let's get into this because I have been meaning to sit down and discuss how we talk about our ancestors and how much of that conversation from all angles, from all sides, is steeped in anti-Blackness. Historically, all Black people have been doing in America, in this country, is trying to survive any way that they can. We went from being enslaved people to Jim Crow violence to Reaganomics and the crack epidemic to mass incarceration to whatever this current iteration in 2021 is, and we have barely had the opportunity to come up for air. That's why when I see things like I am not my ancestors, t-shirts or messaging or tweets, whatever, the idea that Black people were enslaved and simply went with it is just such a deeply offensive take. Now, the bourgeoisie Black folk who just found a way to commodify their Blackness in 2019, so now all of a sudden they are black, black of the black, 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 and the ones that are selling these silly ass t-shirts, it's doing way too much. And it turns back into something that I'm often taking issue with. Why are we so quick to focus on the individual and not the structures or systems that put us in these places? So how does enslavement and slavery become the fault of the Black people who were enslaved and us not actually looking at how significant the apparatus was that made slavery a successful enterprise in the first place? Word to what we've read when we looked into Hortense Spillers is that there is such a distance between us and slavery that we don't even understand the height of violence that our ancestors went through. That was what would allow us to even suggest that I am not my ancestor as a point of pride. For us to make statements as I'm not my ancestor, I fight back, I shoot back, also, we do all these things in the context of knowing that it's not our immediate death guaranteed if we do those things, which greatly changes the way that we would react to things versus our ancestors. And quite frankly, many of us are not nearly as violent as we would like to proclaim. To suggest that our ancestors somehow were sheep, that their behavior and demeanor was the reason why the enterprise of slavery was so successful, ooh, no, that's an ahistorical take. And it also does a great bit of erasure to the history of Black people in this country. I know that it's often implied that Black history is depressing. To learn about the facts of Black people in America leaves people feeling with a plethora of negative feelings. But I actually like to reframe that ideology, and I find deep pride in my ancestors' ability to not just survive the enterprise of slavery and all the complicated choices that my ancestors made in the face of violence. I think of with great integrity and pride because out of it, we became a culture. I know people want to often distance themselves from this idea that African Americans are products of enslaved people. But I see the magnificence of the Black American community and culture. And really, they did this against all odds, against all peoples and structures and systems and institutions that we cannot even begin to fathom. That such a rich and abundant culture came of that. I'm just in amazement. I take great pride in that. And I take great pride in that even as we push for our peers, our modern day peers, and our future offspring to not have to face any form of racial violence in order to be access their basic human rights, I still can take pride in what we came from to this point. I look back and say, yeah, my ancestors did that, and they made choices that I could never begin to understand. And so I cannot suggest that as a person who grew up in modern times, where I do not have to think about the sacrifices that my ancestors had to make, that I'm going to suggest that I'm any more gangsta or gully than they are. Then we veer into the way we talk about our ancestors in the course of dating and relationship advice. And for whatever reason, when it comes to talking about two black people, about how we love, about romance, about partnership, it so often entangles the tropes that we have created around who our ancestors were or were not, and the ideal of the married grandparents versus the shaming of the single black woman. I have watched the entire interview of Kevin Samuels on the Joe Budden podcast, and the amount of times that grandparents were referenced, and some of the purely ahistorical takes that happen, similar to Candace Owens, who gets on here and wax poetics about how our grandparents were married in greater numbers and we were doing better in the old times, and we have gotten away from this sort of conservative traditional ideals. And maybe it's just like y'all be lying with y'all whole and I find that to be like lying with they whole chest, a grift going grift. But it's really a matter of convenience, the way we invoke the black folk of yonder as a way to shame whatever subset of the black community we want to shame within the course of this dating and relationship advice. Now, I will give a point of agreement here, right? If you define traditional values as a heteronormative Judeo-Christian ideal, and if it's easier for that to be identified as what our grandparents had in the 50s and 60s, of the man being seen as the provider, the woman being the home keeper and the submissive one to the provider male, if you want that, you are going to have to feed into those kind of politics. But in a lot of the dating discourse that happens across social media, we aren't really just addressing the people that desire that sort of lifestyle. We are often implying that we are fixing systemic issues by invoking the individual. And then we flip-flop all over the place about what Shirley and Frank used to be doing as a way to fit the narrative that we are trying to project. One, we have to look at this fascination with the idea that our grandparents in mass, in great numbers, were so well off. And what was fascinating in the Joe Budden podcast, one, Joe Budden himself being an abuser. They are suggesting that because pre-1965, based on some statistic, that black people were married in higher numbers than they are today, and that therefore it was implied that our grandparents were doing better than us because the grandfather was the provider and grandma knew how to shut up and bake a sweet potato pie, and we ain't talk about all the ain't shit behavior of a grandpa to the funeral, and so that's how marriages survived, because somehow that's an ideal. It sounds good to whom? It was also implied that Lyndon B. Johnson administrative push was the Great Society, and that they were surprised that within all the reforms and policy changes that were made in this Great Society push, that black women chose welfare over black men. And that was the original sin. Okay.
We put up with it because we have such an irrational, dysfunctional reverence for women in our culture, because we have a matriarchy to where they try to make us question our own mind.
It's our fault, though. Would you agree with that? Ultimately, the black man is leaving the household.
I will say that there is, I want to be careful when I say that, because that's going to get misused. There are some structural things that happen that, okay, in the 60s, when the Great Society came in, and Lyndon Johnson put in the Great Society, they did not expect to happen what happened. Go read the Moynihan Report and Moynihan Scissors. They did not expect to give government assistance and food stamps to the black community and for women to choose the check over the men. They were actually confused as to why this happened. It was like, wait a minute, we thought we would give this to you for a little bit, and then when
Y'all know this is one of my favorite areas of history to talk about because the Social Security Act of 1934 was passed by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. That's FDR. And the original purpose of the social service policies that came with the Social Security Act of 1934 were to keep white women at home and white men in the workforce, to give white men the good jobs and keep white women at home to take care of the children, which is where we get this further ideal that the man should be the provider and the woman should stay home. So black people at large had to fight to get access to various parts of the Social Security Act of 1934. So pensions and unemployment, which were part of this act, were not available to sharecroppers, to domestic workers. What were black folks doing in 1930? This is why government jobs or unionized jobs in the black community have had so much value, because the Brotherhood of Traveling Porters was a union that ensured that train porters, which was largely a job held by black men, were able to opt in to some of these social services provided by the Social Security Act of 1934. And in order to be a train porter, you had to have a college degree. Pushes for liberation also reinvested in hierarchies that allowed a certain portion of the black community to thrive. And still, a large portion of the black community did not have access. So you will see successful middle-class families often be people that work for the post office. If we're going to say that there really are maybe 2 or 3 industries that black people can enter into, how many black people do you think are really going to have means and access to be successful in this setup? Black women, on the other hand, had to fight to access other functions of the Social Security Act of 1934, like the aid for dependent children. Because if the idea is we are going to pass these Social Security policies to ensure that white men have better economic advantages in the labor force, what does that mean for the black man? And in the era, and this is steep, and this is 1930, we are in the 1930s, where Jim Crow law is the precursor to mass incarceration. And I think we also have to consider that where black men were ending up on chain gangs, you could be arrested for loitering, for being out after dark, for public intoxication, for looking at a white woman the wrong way, and immediately your labor rights were taken from you, and you were put into forced labor to build railroads, to be coal miners, to build much of the infrastructure that we have in modern day America was built by the forced labor of black folks. And since we live in a society that shapes motherhood as the ones that take care of the child and fatherhood as the one that financially provides for the children, when black men are removed from any access to financial stability in order to provide for their children, it means that the women are still expected to take care of the children. So black women had to push for aid for dependent children, because in many states and municipalities, laws were passed to keep black women from accessing any function of Social Security Act of 34 or any social services, because it gave them the option to not be domestic workers, to not be sharecroppers. It gave them the option to plausibly hold out for better quality jobs. And so the system, the government institutions, decided to find ways to make access to what we now colloquially call welfare an untenable proposition for black people. First way is a criminalization of black folks, right? If you say that if you have been convicted of a crime, you cannot access social services, that's how you get rid of most of the men being able to access. If you then say to the woman that you have to apply for a certain amount of jobs in order to do it. You cannot have any man in your household. Then also cannot get hired for certain jobs unless you have a partner. You cannot get access to housing unless you have a partner. So the government passes racist, anti-black laws that keep people stuck in a cycle. And also what a lot of this hits at is classism. It is not wrong for poor black people, and it's not wrong for any black person, when we see how much of this country we have built, to turn to this country and say, hey, you need to support us the same way you're supporting the white people. You need to give us the options and the possibility to enter into the workforce with quality jobs and access by doing the same things you do for white people. If you are going to provide aid for dependent children to white women, you also need to be providing it for black women. I mean, I don't know why this is such a hard idea to grab onto, because we see it in modern day where black people make a call for some sort of reform and they say, okay, we're going to give you this piece, but we're going to make it harder on the other side. We're going to give you this, but we're going to make it more complicated on the other side. And so we see this pathology created as soon as black women enter into Assistance for Dependent Children, the ADC. We see this pathology created in society that says that black women are wrong. Black women are lazy. Black women, we get the stereotype of the welfare queen that is perpetuated, one, by black media, by white government officials, that suggest that black women who get access to welfare are lazy, or the bane of the black community, or somehow the downfall of the black community. And it's perpetuated, as I stated, by black media. But on the other side, public housing was initially, again, used for working class white families in order to help them elevate into, when you don't have to worry about your housing, you are able to do other things, as is shown, to economically lift yourself up. And so first it was given to working class white families, and then it was given to black families. You could not be a single mother and get access to public housing. And so I understand this idea, how we want to correlate a lot of these things to, well, if you just date better, we will better the black community. The problem is that what's really been happening is the stress and strain that's been put on the black community absolutely impacts the way that we pursue romance. But romance cannot be the solution to how we correct the ills of the world that have structurally been placed on our community. We don't solve structural racism via our romantic partners. How we have chosen our partnerships has absolutely been impacted by the society that we live in. Black people have never abandoned the idea that black women should marry provider black men. This is also rhetoric that you hear in the trope around the welfare queen. We can go back and look at media clippings from the black news story, black journalism. We can go back and even look at the founding of HBCUs, which were founded with the idea of taking black women from domestic workers to teachers, because if they learned to be teachers, and they could also gain better skills to raise respectable black children, it would make them more desirable for partnerships. It would put them in a place where they could still be the submissive role within a partnership while also not leaving the workforce, because capitalism has always required for a low paid worker in order for capitalism to survive. And if we remove black people from that realm, how does the structure and system survive? When I reference, train porters and working at the post office, industries change. So the industry of porters dissipates. And then one of the only sustaining vehicles for black people to access financial stability has been the military and veterans benefits, which actually provides the social services that the government has been so against giving to its citizens in mass. And that we have even fed into some of this messaging that we do not deserve, or we should just work harder, or we should just individually do what we need to do to sustain within this system. And it's like, and then in the end, we love to highlight the individuals who have made it through, the individuals who have gone on to be successful, even though the majority of our community is exactly where I'm discussing. And yes, definitely, anecdotally, some of us can look to our own ancestors, look to our own families, and suggest that, well, look at how they did it and how they came about, and they did so well. And oftentimes I will say, well, let's interrogate the politics of what was happening with your family, and we can often point to why this certain exceptionalism happened for some but did not happen for the majority. And word to Tracy McMillan Cotton, this is a book we're reading in the book club currently, Thick, which is a great listen on Audible. Again, audible.com/Julesy, or text Julesy to 500 get your first month free, and then pick up Thick because Dr. Cotton reads it herself. And I'm still so sad that we could not get her for an author chat, because it would have been amazing to have these conversations. But literally, there's several chapters: Dying to be Competent, or The Price of Fabulousness, and the chapter on beauty. And she actually makes the point that any system of oppression must allow exceptions to validate itself as meritorious. How else will those who are oppressed by the system internalize their own oppression? Word to Dr. Cotton. And I think this definitely connects back to how we even talk about our ancestors, how we can construct these ideas or these fictive characters who both were amazing because they held on to traditional morals and they did the right thing, even while acknowledging how violent that holding on might have been for them, but nobody talked about it to the funeral. Or we castrate this idea of the single Black woman who made horrible decisions that really dismantled or demeaned the Black man, when rather the Black man has always consistently been demeaned by the institutions, by the society, by the structure of our society. Both Black men and women have been demeaned. Both Black men and Black women have been demeaned by the institutional and structural racism that our society is built upon. And we both have had to make choices for our own safety, for our own survival. And as we broaden our understanding, as we can look back at history, as we can talk about all the things that were happening, and we gain new language and new means to have these discussions, we have to be careful not to flatten the history of either. And I know people often want to be derogatory towards me because I identify as a Black feminist, but we can have a further discussion about the punitive nature of child support. And part of the Black feminist framework has acknowledged Black women's necessity in getting access to that, but that child support is not the solution towards our liberation, because it still relies on the state owning the Black man. We can have those conversations. Actually, I have had those conversations. Holla at me over on Patreon, where we be talking about these things. Black women did not choose welfare, did not choose to access the Social Security Act of 1934 over Black men. It was literally a policy of the state that told Black women, you need to choose between your children eating a meal and your ability to partner, while simultaneously telling Black men that you have no option. You broadly have no option for entering into the equitable labor force. You can do gigs. And, now we call it like the gig economy because it sounds so nice. Oh, he's an Uber driver, does DoorDash. But like back in the 50s, 60s, the 1940s, what were you doing for work? Were you a migrant worker up and down the East Coast picking fruits like my family was? Were you a sharecropper? Were you running some sort of business that you were able to sustain within your community until the white folks found a way to do something violent? Because a lot of our endings, a lot of our inability to achieve as a community great financial success does not come down to how we partner or how we access welfare, but the violence that has been enacted by racial terrorism. Like, we can't go back and talk about our ancestors and talk about people that were enslaved, talk about people that were living during the most violent era of America that follows the Emancipation Proclamation, right? From the late 1870s to the 1920s is like one of the most violent periods for Black people in America. And then we go right into Jim Crow, which is a continued violence that is embedded into state and local laws. Be careful. Be careful how you move. That's all I'm saying. And be careful about how you invoke the legacy of our Black folks. The books are there to read and to listen to. Holla at Audible and get you some. I think Thick is a great book that kind of makes it a lot easier to start on this conversation without getting too like historical or academic in text, and really allows you to come into your own understanding. So definitely holla at Tressie McMillan Cotton's book. And then come over to the book club. Come on over and join the discussion with us. All right. I'll see you on the other side. Deuces.